The return Marcus Blackwood's jet touched down on the private runway just outside the city. For once, he hadn't called ahead to announce his arrival. Meetings in London had ended earlier than planned, and though he rarely adjusted his schedule for anyone, an urge he didn't fully understand had driven him home. The sprawling Blackwood estate gleamed under the late afternoon sun. The marble pillars, endless windows, and meticulously trimmed gardens spoke of power and money. Yet to Marcus it had begun to feel like a mausoleum, silent and heavy since his wife's passing 3 years ago. Inside, servants moved with quiet efficiency. They froze when Marcus entered, his tall frame and sharp eyes cutting through the air like a blade. He was a man used to command, his words more often orders than conversations. "Where is Jacob?" he asked the butler. "In the playroom, sir," the older man answered with hesitation. "With Miss Williams." Marcus frowned. Maya Williams. She had been hired just 6 months ago, a maid with no pedigree, no family name, and most glaring of all, a woman of color in a household that still clung to old prejudices. His board members had whispered disapproval. His relatives sneered, but Marcus had ignored them. She was efficient, respectful, and Jacob had grown strangely attached to her. That alone had been reason enough to keep her. But attachment, Marcus reminded himself, was dangerous. Jacob was fragile, too fragile. He strode down the long corridor, his shoes echoing on the polished floor. As he approached the playroom, he heard something unusual. Laughter. Not the muted chuckle of polite company, but a bright, ringing giggle that seemed to fill the hall. Marcus stopped, stunned. He had not heard his son laugh like that in months. Pushing the door open, he froze. There, on the thick Persian rug, Maya was down on all fours, her dark hair falling loose from its bun, cheeks flushed. And riding on her back, grinning with wide-eyed delight, was Jacob. His thin legs dangled uselessly, but his arms clutched her shoulders as he shouted, "Faster, Maya, faster!" For a moment, Marcus could not breathe. His son, paralyzed, withdrawn, silent for weeks, was laughing. But the sight twisted Marcus's chest with something darker. Humiliation, fear, rage. His heir, his only child, playing like a peasant on the back of a maid. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Maya?" Marcus's voice cracked like a whip. The laughter died instantly. Jacob froze mid-giggle, his small body stiffening. Maya stopped, her eyes wide, but she did not lower herself to the ground. "Daddy," Jacob whispered, fear flickering in his voice. "I was just playing." Marcus's jaw clenched. "Playing? You call this playing? My son, my heir, riding on the back of a servant as though he were a common child in the street? His wheelchair," he gestured sharply to the corner where it sat abandoned, "is where he belongs, not crawling on the floor." Maya's voice trembled, but it was steady enough to speak. "Sir, I didn't mean any harm. Jacob hasn't laughed in weeks. I only wanted him to feel normal, even for a little while." The words struck him, but his pride drowned out the truth in them. "Normal?" he spat. "You think this is normal? You think my son's dignity is a game?" He took a step forward, fury in his eyes. Startled by the sudden movement, Maya lost her balance. Jacob, still clinging to her shoulders, slipped forward. His small body toppled onto the rug, his head striking the edge of a low wooden table. The room erupted in chaos. "Jacob!" Maya cried, scrambling to scoop him into her arms. A sharp cry tore from the boy's lips as a thin line of blood appeared on his forehead. Marcus's heart stopped. "Oh my God!" "Someone call an ambulance now," he roared, his voice raw with panic. 2 servants rushed forward, one wrapping Jacob gently in a blanket. Marcus followed, his mind a blur, stomach in knots. He had not protected his son. Again. Maya clutched Jacob's small hand as the boy whimpered. "I'm so sorry," she whispered through tears. "I didn't mean, he just slipped." Marcus turned on her, rage blinding him. He grabbed a fistful of her hair, yanking her upright. "You reckless, incompetent fool. Do you have any idea what you've done? What this looks like? You dare endanger my son in my own house." His voice was venom, his face red with fury. Her eyes watered, pain searing her scalp, but deeper still was the humiliation. She bit her lip, trembling, and whispered, "He hasn't laughed like this in so long, please. I only wanted him to smile again." The ambulance siren wailed in the distance, growing louder. Servants rushed Jacob out the door, his small form wrapped tightly, his tears staining the blanket. Marcus released Maya, shoving her aside. She stumbled, catching herself against the wall. He glared at her, his chest heaving. If anything happens to my son, he hissed, your life here is over. Do you understand me? Over. Maya's knees buckled. She sank to the floor, her heart pounding, tears streaking her cheeks. She could still feel the weight of Jacob's small hands on her shoulders, the sound of his laughter ringing in her ears. And though terror and humiliation consumed her, one truth burned inside her chest. For a few precious minutes, Jacob had been happy. He had laughed. He had felt alive. The sound of tires screeched outside as the ambulance sped away with Jacob inside. Marcus followed, his face pale, his world unraveling. Behind them in the silent hall, Maya whispered to herself, please, God, let him be okay. The silence of the house. The hospital corridors stretched endlessly, their white walls glaring under the fluorescent lights, every step echoing Marcus Blackwood's fear back to him. For a man who commanded empires, whose name opened doors and whose fortune could bend nations, the sterile hallways reduced him to what he truly was in this moment. A father terrified of losing his son. He sat outside the emergency room, his perfectly tailored suit crumpled against the plastic chair, his hands trembling though he tried to hide it. He replayed the scene again and again, the rug, Maya's dark hair falling loose, Jacob's laugh ringing like a bell, and then the sudden sickening sound of his boy's small body hitting wood. Pride, rage, humiliation, none of it mattered anymore. All that remained was the fragile life of his child. Inside the emergency ward, Jacob lay under the harsh glow of surgical lights while doctors stitched the wound on his forehead and ran scans to ensure no deeper damage had been done. Marcus wanted to storm inside, demand answers, throw money at the doctors until they guaranteed Jacob's safety. But for once, his wealth was useless. His power, his empire, his billions, they all shrank before the vulnerability of a 5-year-old boy. He pressed his palms together, bowing his head, and for the first time in years, Marcus whispered a prayer. It was awkward on his lips, like speaking a language long forgotten, but it was sincere. Please don't take him. He's all I have left. Maya sat far down the corridor, her uniform stained with Jacob's blood, her face pale from both guilt and fear. She dared not come closer, dared not intrude on Marcus's storm of grief and fury. Yet she could not leave either. Every fiber of her being was tied to Jacob. Every smile she had managed to coax from him in recent months had bound her heart more tightly to the boy. She had no right to care this much. Not as a servant, not as someone whose presence was tolerated only because Jacob responded to her. But love does not ask for permission, and Maya loved that child as if he were her own. She clasped her hands in her lap, nails digging into her skin as she repeated silently, please let him be safe. Please let him wake up with that light in his eyes again. Hours dragged like years until finally a doctor emerged. Marcus shot to his feet, his imposing figure towering over the exhausted physician. How is my son? His voice was sharp, commanding, but beneath it trembled desperation. The doctor adjusted his glasses, glancing first at Marcus, then at Maya in the distance, who had risen to her feet though she did not dare step closer. Your son is stable, the doctor said. The wound required stitches, but thankfully there is no internal bleeding and no permanent damage. He needs rest. He will recover. Marcus exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Relief crashed into him like a wave, leaving him momentarily weak. But before gratitude could soften him, pride returned like armor. He turned on Maya, his voice cold and cutting. You see what your recklessness has done? You nearly cost me my son tonight. Maya lowered her gaze, shame burning her cheeks. I'm sorry, sir. Truly I am. I only wanted Jacob to feel alive again. He has been trapped in that chair, trapped in silence. And when he laughed today, I saw something in him I hadn't seen in so long. I thought it was worth it. Worth it. Marcus's voice thundered through the corridor, causing nurses to glance nervously their way. Worth my son's blood? Worth humiliating my family? You forget your place, Miss Williams. You are a servant, not a nurse, not a therapist, and certainly not family. Do not mistake kindness for permission. Her eyes lifted to meet his then, and for a heartbeat Marcus faltered. There was pain in her gaze, yes, but there was also steel. With respect, sir, Maya said quietly. You may see me as nothing, but Jacob sees me. He laughs with me. He talks to me. And if I can give him a moment of happiness, even if it costs me your anger, then yes, it was worth it. The boldness of her words stunned him. Few dared to challenge Marcus Blackwood, and certainly no servant ever had. For a moment he wanted to dismiss her on the spot, to erase her from his home and from Jacob's life. Yet something in him hesitated. Perhaps it was because her words rang with truth he did not wish to face. Or perhaps it was the image of Jacob's rare laughter that lingered in his memory, mocking his fury. He turned away sharply, unwilling to answer, unwilling to admit even to himself that she might be right. When Jacob was finally moved to a private room, Marcus stationed himself at the bedside like a sentry, refusing to leave. He watched the boy's chest rise and fall. Every breath a fragile miracle. Maya lingered at the doorway, torn between duty and dismissal, unsure if she should enter. It was Jacob who settled the matter. His eyelids fluttered and his small voice, weak but clear, whispered, "Maya?" Marcus stiffened, but Jacob's eyes did not search for him. They searched for her. Maya hurried to the bed, kneeling beside him, tears spilling down her face as she stroked his hair gently. "I'm here, Jacob, you're safe. Everything's okay, don't leave me," he murmured, clinging to her hand with surprising strength for one so frail. "I won't," she promised. "Not ever." Marcus turned away, his throat tightening. His son, his heir, the only family he had left, had not called for him in his moment of fear. He had called for the maid. Pride and jealousy warred inside him, but beneath them was something worse. Shame. Because deep down, Marcus knew why Jacob did not call for him. He had built walls of steel and silence between himself and his boy, thinking that wealth and protection were enough. But a child did not need empires. A child needed love. And in that, Maya had given more than he had. The drive back to the estate the next day was suffocating. Jacob dozed in the back seat, his small hand still wrapped around Maya's fingers as if afraid she might vanish if he let go. Marcus sat beside them, silent, his thoughts a battlefield. The car rolled up the long driveway and the house loomed ahead, but instead of feeling like homecoming, it felt like judgment. The Blackwood mansion had witnessed generations of pride, wealth, and power, but in its endless halls, laughter had always been scarce. That night, as Jacob slept in his bed with Maya sitting watch beside him, Marcus stood in his study, staring at the portrait of his late wife. Her painted eyes seemed to pierce him, full of the warmth he had once known. He whispered bitterly, "I don't know how to reach him. I don't know how to love him without breaking him." His reflection in the glass was hard, weary, and alone. For the first time in years, Marcus wondered if all his power had made him weak in the only place that mattered, inside his own home. And so the house, vast and grand, sank into silence once again. But this silence was no longer the empty quiet of wealth. It was heavy with questions, with guilt, with unspoken truths. Marcus was beginning to see that the maid he had nearly cast out was perhaps the only bridge left to his son's heart. Whether he could cross it or whether his pride would let him remained to be seen. The confrontation, the following days, unfolded like a storm that refused to pass. The Blackwood estate, usually buzzing with disciplined silence and carefully rehearsed order, now seemed charged with tension that none of the staff could ignore. Every servant moved quietly, afraid of setting off the temper that hung heavy in the halls. Marcus prowled the corridors like a restless lion, his mind torn between anger and an ache he could not name. The image of Jacob's laughter clung to him as stubbornly as the memory of his fall. He told himself that his rage was justified, that Maya's reckless behavior had nearly endangered his son's life. But another part of him, quieter yet unyielding, whispered that she had given Jacob something he himself had not managed to give in years: joy. Jacob, meanwhile, had changed since the accident. Though he bore a small bandage on his forehead, he seemed lighter, more awake, as if the brief spark of laughter had lit something inside him that refused to dim. He no longer sat silently in his wheelchair, staring at the windows with vacant eyes. Instead, he asked questions, wanted stories, and most of all, he clung to Maya with an intensity that startled even her. Wherever she went, Jacob's gaze followed, and if she left the room, he would grow anxious until she returned. It was this attachment that ignited the inevitable confrontation. On the fourth evening after the hospital visit, Marcus found Maya in the library. She sat cross-legged on the rug, Jacob leaning against her shoulder as she read aloud from a book of fables, her soft voice filling the room with warmth that seemed foreign in the cold, echoing space. Jacob's eyes sparkled, his lips curving into a smile every few moments as he listened. "Enough," Marcus said from the doorway, his voice heavy with finality. Maya looked up, startled, but she did not put the book down. Jacob's smile faltered, sensing the shift in the air. "Father?" he asked hesitantly. "Go to your room, Jacob," Marcus ordered, his tone sharp. "Now," Marcus cut him off, his eyes never leaving Maya. The boy's face fell, but at Maya's gentle nod, he allowed himself to be wheeled out by one of the servants, his head turning back at every step as though he feared he might not see her again. When the door closed, Marcus stepped further into the library, his presence filling the space like a shadow. "This ends tonight," he said, his voice low but firm. "I have tolerated your methods, your interference, your reckless disregard for discipline. But no more. You will gather your things and leave my house tomorrow morning." Maya's breath caught in her chest, but she lifted her chin, refusing to bow. "With respect, sir, Jacob needs me. If you send me away, you will crush the little hope he has left." Marcus's laugh was bitter, sharp. "Hope? You think you are his hope? He has doctors, therapists, specialists that I pay fortunes to consult. He has me, his father. He does not need a maid playing horse on the floor." She rose to her feet, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "He does need me. Not because I am better than you, not because I am anyone important, but because I see him, not as a patient, not as a burden, not as an heir to protect, but as a little boy who is hurting. He calls for me because I listen when he cries. I laugh when he jokes. I remind him that even if his legs don't work, his spirit does. Can you say the same, sir?" The words hit Marcus like a blow, but he masked his reaction behind a glare. "How dare you speak to me this way in my own house?" "Because someone has to," Maya replied, her voice breaking with emotion but carrying a strength Marcus could not ignore. "You are a great man, Mr. Blackwood. You build companies, control boardrooms, move nations with your signature. But in the quiet of this house, you are just a father who has forgotten how to be gentle. Jacob doesn't need your empire. He needs your arms, your time, your love. And if I am the only one willing to give him that, then I will, even if it means losing everything else." For a long moment, silence hung between them, thick and suffocating. Marcus's fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight, his pride screaming to assert control. Yet beneath it all, her words carved fissures into the walls he had built around himself. He wanted to shout, to dismiss her insolence, but the truth in her voice refused to be silenced. At that moment, the door burst open. Jacob wheeled himself back inside, his small face wet with tears. "No," he cried, his voice trembling with desperation. "Don't send her away, Daddy." "Please, please don't." His little hands gripped the wheels of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. "If she leaves, I don't want to stay here either." The raw terror in his voice silenced Marcus. For the first time, he saw not the heir to his fortune, not the fragile boy bound to a chair, but his child. Frightened, desperate, clinging to the one person who made him feel alive. Marcus's breath caught in his throat, the iron of his pride melting into something softer, something he had long buried. He looked at Maya, who stood frozen, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. He looked at Jacob, trembling but fierce in his plea. And in that moment, Marcus realized the choice before him. He could cling to pride, to appearances, to the rigid control that had defined his life. Or he could bend, humble himself, and give his son what he truly needed. His voice, when it came, was hoarse, stripped of the authority he always carried. "Go to bed, Jacob," he said quietly. "We will talk about this in the morning." Jacob hesitated, his gaze darting between his father and Maya. Finally he whispered, "Promise you won't send her away?" Marcus swallowed hard. Not tonight. It was enough. Jacob wheeled himself back out, calmer now, though his shoulders still shook. When the door closed again, Marcus turned back to Maya. His face was unreadable, but his voice had lost some of its venom. "You test my patience, Miss Williams, but for reasons I don't yet understand, my son sees something in you. For now, you stay." Maya bowed her head slightly, relief washing over her, though she knew the battle was far from over. She had won a reprieve, not a victory. Marcus Blackwood was a man carved from stone, and stones did not soften easily. But for Jacob's sake, she would endure his scorn. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Marcus sat alone in his study, staring into the fire. His mind replayed the confrontation, the tears in Jacob's eyes, the unshakable conviction in Maya's voice. He hated her for being right, hated her for holding a mirror to his failures. And yet, buried deep beneath the anger, he felt something he had not felt in years. The stirrings of change. The silence of the house was no longer empty. It was the silence before a reckoning, before the walls would crack, Marcus did not know it yet, but his life and his son's would never be the same. The awakening. The days that followed the confrontation in the library were not peaceful, but they were different. Something had shifted within the walls of the Blackwood estate. Something small yet undeniable. Marcus had not rescinded his threat to dismiss Maya, but he had not carried it out either. And that in itself felt like a silent acknowledgement of defeat. Jacob sensed the change too. No longer did he move about the house like a ghost confined to his chair. He now insisted on spending every waking hour in Maya's company. And though Marcus grumbled and pretended to disapprove, he found himself lingering more often in the background, drawn by a force he would not name. It began with play disguised as therapy. Maya, with her natural resourcefulness and quiet intelligence, transformed Jacob's daily routine into something more than sterile exercises prescribed by doctors. Where the physical therapist had instructed stretches and repetitive motions that left the boy listless and withdrawn, Maya wove them into games. She placed toy soldiers across the rug and encouraged Jacob to reach for them, rewarding his effort with laughter and stories of battles won. She arranged colored blocks in tall towers and coaxed him to knock them over, disguising the strain of movement as triumph. When he managed even the smallest flex of his weak legs, she cheered as if he had climbed a mountain. Jacob responded in ways no professional had managed. His cheeks grew rosier, his eyes brighter, his voice louder. He complained less about his chair, asked fewer questions about why his legs would not obey him, and instead began to talk about the future with the hesitant hope of a child daring to dream again. One afternoon, Maya persuaded him to try standing with her support. He clutched her hands tightly, his little face twisted with concentration as she steadied him. For only a heartbeat, his weight shifted from the chair to his legs, and though he collapsed back almost instantly, the thrill of the attempt lit his expression like fire. "I did it, Maya," he exclaimed breathlessly, tears welling in his eyes. "I really did it." "You did, Jacob," Maya whispered, hugging him fiercely. "And you'll do it again. And one day you'll walk on your own. I know you will." Unbeknownst to them, Marcus had been watching from the doorway. He had meant only to pass by, but the sight rooted him in place. His heart ached at the sound of Jacob's joy, a joy he had thought lost forever. Yet mingled with the ache was shame, for it was not he who had given his son this hope, but the woman he had once threatened to throw out like refuse. He turned away before they noticed his presence, retreating to his study, where the fire's glow could not burn away the frost that pride had left in his chest. But pride was not invincible. Night after night, Marcus found himself replaying the moments he glimpsed in secret. Jacob's laughter, his fragile attempts at movement, Maya's patient encouragement. Each scene gnawed at the walls of arrogance that Marcus had spent a lifetime constructing. He told himself it was dangerous, that a servant's role should never cross into intimacy, that boundaries existed for a reason. Yet when Jacob, in his small, trembling voice, began to ask at dinner whether his father had seen what he could do, Marcus could not answer with indifference. The boy's hope pierced him more sharply than any boardroom challenge ever had. One evening after the meal, Jacob refused to be wheeled away until Marcus agreed to watch him play the tower game with Maya. Reluctantly, Marcus followed them into the parlor where Maya had arranged blocks on the carpet. He sat stiffly in a chair as Jacob, leaning against Maya for balance, knocked down a tower with a shaky push of his hand. The blocks clattered to the floor, and Jacob erupted in laughter, clapping his small hands together. "Did you see, Daddy? I made it fall all by myself." Marcus's throat tightened. He nodded stiffly, his voice rough. "I saw, son. Well done." The boy's smile in response was so radiant, so full of life, that it pierced Marcus to his very soul. For the first time in years, he realized that his son did not crave protection or perfection from him. He craved acknowledgement. He craved love, and so Marcus began to linger more often, though he rarely spoke. He would sit at the edges of rooms, watching quietly as Maya guided Jacob through their disguised exercises, as she filled the cold air of the mansion with stories and songs. The staff whispered about the change, noting how the boys' laughter now echoed through the halls that had once been silent tombs. For them, Maya's presence was like a fragile flame in a house long frozen, and though Marcus did not admit it, he too was drawn to its warmth. But not all change is welcome, and not all battles are won without resistance. Marcus found himself torn in ways he could scarcely endure. His mind told him that allowing Maya such influence over Jacob was dangerous, that it undermined his authority, his image, the carefully curated reputation of the Blackwood name. Yet his heart, long neglected and nearly forgotten, told him that dismissing her would break his son in ways no wealth could repair. The conflict gnawed at him day and night, leaving him restless, irritable, unable to focus even on the empires he commanded. For the first time, Marcus Blackwood, master of industries and sovereign of wealth, was utterly powerless in his own home. One night, unable to sleep, he wandered the halls and found himself outside Jacob's room. The door was ajar and he peeked inside, his chest tightening at the sight. Jacob slept peacefully, his small chest rising and falling in rhythm, his bandaged forehead now nearly healed. Beside him in a chair sat Maya, dozing lightly with her head tilted against the wall, still holding Jacob's hand as though to reassure him even in dreams. The sight disarmed Marcus in a way he had not thought possible. He realized with a pang that stole his breath that he had not touched his son's hand in months. Closing the door softly, Marcus leaned against the wall, overwhelmed. He thought of his late wife, of the warmth she had carried so effortlessly, the way she had filled the house with tenderness that balanced his steel. She had been the bridge between father and son, and in her absence that bridge had crumbled into dust. And now, in ways he did not understand, this maid, this young woman he had dismissed as unworthy, was rebuilding it. Stone by fragile stone. For the first time, Marcus allowed himself to wonder if dignity was not found in appearances or power, but in the willingness to kneel on the rug and carry a child on your back simply to hear him laugh. The transformation. The change was not sudden, nor was it dramatic in the way Marcus Blackwood was accustomed to in his empire of boardrooms and acquisitions. It was gradual, like winter giving way to spring where the frost still lingered but buds began to press stubbornly through the soil. Within the walls of the Blackwood estate, the silence that had once been oppressive now softened under the sound of Jacob's laughter and Maya's gentle encouragement. The mansion had not been built for warmth. It was designed for grandeur, for awe, for respect. But in those days it began to house something far rarer: hope. Jacob's progress was undeniable. His therapists, who had once spoken in cautious tones and vague possibilities, now noted small but measurable improvements. His upper body strength grew as he eagerly participated in the playful games Maya devised. His posture straightened when he sat in his chair, his arms more confident in pushing the wheels himself. He began to experiment with movement in ways he had previously refused, emboldened by Maya's endless patience and his father's reluctant but growing presence during their sessions. For a boy who had once withdrawn into himself, Jacob now brimmed with a fragile courage. But perhaps the greater transformation was not in Jacob, but in Marcus himself. At first, his appearances during these exercises were stiff and reluctant, his arms folded, his gaze sharp, as though he were an inspector evaluating a project. Yet over time, something shifted in him. His folded arms would slowly lower, his eyes would soften, and once, without realizing it, he even found himself leaning forward, holding his breath as Jacob strained to knock over a tower of blocks. When the tower toppled and Jacob cheered, Marcus felt a surge of pride that startled him. It was not the pride of a businessman securing a deal, but the pride of a father watching his child achieve the impossible. Still, Marcus resisted acknowledging these feelings openly. He was a man forged by discipline and appearances, trained to conceal weakness. Affection to him had always felt like vulnerability, and vulnerability was something he had sworn never to show. Yet the boy's smile eroded those defenses day after day, and the maid's unwavering devotion confronted him with truths he could no longer ignore. He had once believed that strength was measured in power, wealth, and control, but now he began to suspect that true strength lay in gentleness, the very thing he had denied both his son and himself. One afternoon, Marcus returned from a meeting earlier than expected. Instead of finding his son sitting silently by the window as he had for so many months, he heard music floating down the hall. Curious, he followed the sound to the drawing room. There, he found Jacob sitting in his chair with a small drum across his lap, tapping a hesitant rhythm while Maya clapped along, encouraging him. The boy's concentration was fierce, his tongue peeking out between his teeth as he tried to keep the beat. When he faltered, Maya laughed and tapped her own hands against her knees to guide him back. Marcus lingered unseen in the doorway, his chest tightening at the sight. Jacob was not simply moving his arms. He was creating something, participating in life, rediscovering joy through rhythm. For years, Marcus had tried to give his son the best of everything: schools, doctors, equipment. But he realized in that moment that the best had not been what Jacob needed. What Jacob needed was presence, encouragement, and love that asked for nothing in return. And it was Maya, not he, who had given it. Later that evening at dinner, Marcus surprised himself. When Jacob excitedly described his drumming practice, Marcus leaned forward and asked, "Will you show me tomorrow?" The boy's eyes widened, glowing with surprise and delight, and Maya, seated beside him, glanced at Marcus with quiet astonishment. It was the first time Marcus had willingly asked to join their world instead of remaining apart. From that day, the transformation accelerated. Marcus began to involve himself, awkwardly at first, but sincerely. He held the blocks Jacob knocked over. He applauded when his son completed an exercise, and once, when Maya encouraged Jacob to attempt standing again, Marcus instinctively stepped forward to steady his son's back. The contact was brief, but in that moment, Jacob looked up at him with shining eyes and whispered, "Thanks, Daddy." It was a simple phrase, but to Marcus it was a revelation. His son still looked to him, not as a businessman, not as a billionaire, but as a father. Yet alongside this progress came new challenges. Marcus's pride still flared at times, especially when the staff whispered of Maya's influence or when guests who visited noticed Jacob's growing attachment to her. He bristled at the idea that a servant had succeeded where he had failed. But each time he considered acting on that pride, Jacob's face stopped him. The boy's fragile happiness was more important than appearances. And slowly Marcus began to understand that protecting his son's spirit was as vital as protecting his health. Maya, for her part, noticed the changes with quiet gratitude. She did not seek recognition, nor did she press for acknowledgement. Her only concern was Jacob's well-being, yet she could not help but sense the subtle softening in Marcus's gaze when he watched his son. He remained stern, even distant at times, but there was less venom in his words and more weight in his silences. The man who had once seemed carved entirely of stone now showed cracks, and through those cracks, humanity began to emerge. The turning point came one evening when a storm raged outside, lashing the windows with rain and shaking the great chandeliers. The power flickered, and Jacob, frightened by the thunder, clung to Maya. She drew him into her lap, rocking him gently, whispering stories to distract him from the noise. Marcus entered the room at that moment, his face stern as always, but something in the scene pierced him. Without a word, he crossed the room and placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder. The boy looked up, startled, then buried his face against his father's chest, seeking comfort. For the first time in years, Marcus held his son close, his large hand resting protectively on the boy's small back. Maya sat silently, her heart swelling at the sight. In that fragile embrace, she saw not a billionaire or a master of industry, but a father reclaiming his role. It was awkward, uncertain, but it was real, and for Jacob it was everything. That night, after Jacob finally drifted to sleep, Marcus lingered in the hallway with Maya. For once, his voice was not cold, but quiet, almost uncertain. "You've done more for him than I ever thought possible," he admitted, his eyes avoiding hers. "I may not like your methods, but I cannot deny the results." Maya bowed her head, her voice gentle.
"All he needed was someone to believe in him, sir."
"Children do not grow on wealth. They grow on love." Marcus did not reply, but her words echoed in him long after she left. He returned to his study, staring at the portrait of his late wife once again. For years he had thought himself the guardian of his son's legacy, but perhaps he had been nothing more than a jailer, and now slowly, painfully, with Maya's help, he was learning to set his child free. The test of fire. The transformation within the Blackwood estate was becoming evident, but change that blossoms in secret often faces its fiercest trial in the open. Marcus, for all his newfound softness, still bore the weight of his name, his empire, and the scrutiny of a world that watched him as if his every move was a headline. And so, when an invitation arrived for the annual Blackwood Foundation Gala, a grand event attended by the city's most powerful families, business partners, and journalists, Marcus knew there was no avoiding it. It was not merely a social gathering, but a performance of power. One he had curated for years to remind the world of his family's untouchable status. For the first time, however, the question of Jacob's presence loomed heavy. In years past, Marcus had kept his son hidden from the gala, unwilling to expose him to whispered judgments, pitying glances, or cruel curiosity. But Jacob, now stronger and more spirited under Maya's care, begged to attend. "I want to go, Daddy," he insisted one evening, his small hands gripping the wheels of his chair. "I don't want to stay home anymore. I want to see what it's like. I want to be with you." Marcus's heart clenched. He feared the world's cruelty, feared the way men and women in jeweled gowns and silk suits would look at his boy. But Jacob's eyes were filled with something he had not seen in so long, courage, even excitement. And so, against every instinct, Marcus agreed. The night of the gala shimmered with opulence. The ballroom gleamed with chandeliers, polished marble, and gold accents that spoke of wealth beyond imagination. Cameras flashed as limousines lined the entrance, and the most influential names in the city drifted inside with practiced grace. When Marcus entered, tall and commanding in his black tuxedo, all eyes turned. He was the Blackwood patriarch, the billionaire, the man who shaped economies. But when the crowd saw the small wheelchair at his side, whispers rippled like wildfire. Jacob sat proudly in his chair, dressed in a tiny tailored suit, his hair neatly combed, his smile radiant. Beside him walked Maya, in a modest but elegant gown Marcus had insisted she wear for the occasion. Less as an equal, more as a companion for Jacob, yet her quiet poise outshone many of the glittering guests. For a time, everything went smoothly. Marcus greeted associates, shaking hands and nodding through conversations, while Jacob's wide eyes took in the spectacle. Maya kept close, gently guiding the boy when needed, but it was not long before the whispers became sharper, crueler. "That's the Blackwood heir?" someone murmured too loudly. "In a chair? How tragic." "A shame," another voice sneered, hidden behind a champagne glass. "Billions, and not even his own son can walk." And then from across the room, laughter. Two children, dressed in velvet and silk, stared at Jacob before mimicking the motion of pushing an invisible wheelchair, their cruel giggles echoing like knives. Jacob's smile faltered, his hands freezing on the wheels. His cheeks flushed red, his eyes dropping to the floor as tears threatened to spill. Marcus saw it. The humiliation he had feared unfolded before him, and for a moment his pride threatened to shatter. But before he could move, Maya was there. She knelt beside Jacob, her voice steady, her eyes fierce. "Don't you dare hide your face, Jacob, do you hear me? You are stronger than every person in this room. They may walk with their legs, but you—" She pressed a hand to his chest. "You walk with your courage. Look at me, you are not less, you are more." Jacob's lip trembled, but he lifted his eyes to hers, clinging to her words. And then Marcus stepped forward. For once he did not care about appearances, about reputation, about the iron walls of pride that had always guarded him. He turned to the room, his voice booming across the marble floor. "Yes," he declared, his gaze sweeping over the startled guests. "This is my son, Jacob Blackwood. He is the bravest person here tonight. Do you see that chair? It does not define him. It carries him until he is ready to walk again, and I promise you he will, and when he does, the world will remember not his weakness but his strength." The room fell silent. Whispers died in throats, and even the cruel children shrank behind their parents' legs. Maya's eyes filled with tears as she looked up at Marcus, stunned by the raw truth in his words. Jacob, his small chest rising and falling rapidly, stared at his father with awe. The moment hung like fire in the air. For the first time, Marcus Blackwood had not shielded his son from the world. He had lifted him up, claimed him, and declared his worth for all to hear. It was not wealth, nor power, nor pride that spoke in that moment, but love. Jacob's small hand reached up, gripping his father's. "Thank you, Daddy," he whispered, his voice trembling, and Marcus, swallowing past the lump in his throat, knelt beside the chair and embraced his boy, not as a man shielding weakness, but as a father honoring strength. That night, the gala did not remember the billion-dollar deals or the jeweled gowns. It remembered the sight of a man who ruled empires kneeling beside his son, and a child who carried more courage in his frail body than many in that grand room had ever known. The new family. The gala had left its mark on the Blackwood name, but not in the way Marcus had feared. For days after, Newspapers and magazines did not gossip about his fortune or speculate on his latest business maneuvers. Instead, they carried a photograph that had been captured in a single unguarded moment. Marcus Blackwood kneeling beside his son, his arm protectively around the boy's shoulders, while Jacob looked up at him with a courage that belied his years. The image was powerful, not of wealth but of humanity, and it struck chords far beyond the gilded circles of influence. For the first time in years, Marcus found himself praised not as a titan of industry but as a father. And though pride still flickered within him, it was no longer the hollow pride of reputation, it was the fierce, quiet pride of love. Back at the estate, Jacob was restless. The humiliation he had faced at the gala still haunted him in flickering shadows, but the memory of his father's defense, of Maya's unwavering words, burned brighter. He began to push himself harder, demanding longer sessions, insisting on practicing movements he had once refused. His small body strained with effort, and there were days when tears of frustration streaked his cheeks. Yet Maya was always there, kneeling beside him, encouraging him softly, reminding him that progress was not measured in leaps, but in steps, however small. Marcus, too, became a constant presence. He no longer lingered in doorways as a distant observer but joined them openly. At first his attempts were clumsy, his voice too stern when he meant encouragement, his hands too hesitant when steadying Jacob's fragile frame. But he was learning. He learned to celebrate the smallest victories, to laugh when Jacob laughed, to soothe when Jacob faltered. For the first time since his wife's death, Marcus was discovering what it meant to live not for empire but for family. The pivotal moment arrived on a quiet afternoon, weeks after the gala. The sun streamed through the tall windows of the parlor, casting golden patterns across the rug where Jacob sat with Maya. She had been working with him tirelessly, guiding his legs, supporting his weight in carefully measured attempts. Marcus watched silently from his chair, his heart pounding as Jacob took a deep breath, determination etched into his small features. "Are you ready, Jacob?" Maya asked gently, her voice steady but her eyes shining with quiet hope. Jacob nodded, gripping her hands tightly. "I want to try. I want to show Daddy." Slowly, carefully, Maya helped him rise from the chair. His legs trembled violently, his knees threatening to buckle, but he clenched his jaw, fighting to stay upright. Marcus instinctively half rose, ready to catch him, but Maya shook her head slightly, urging patience. She steadied Jacob at the shoulders, whispering encouragement, while the boy's face flushed with the strain of effort. And then, with a sound that was half gasp and half sob, Jacob moved one foot forward. It was barely more than a shuffle, the smallest of steps, but it was his. The boy swayed, nearly falling, but Maya caught him, her arms strong despite her slight frame. Jacob collapsed against her, breathless, his face pressed into her shoulder, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I did it," he whispered hoarsely. "Daddy, I did it." Marcus could no longer contain himself. He crossed the room in great strides and knelt beside them both, his arms encircling his son, and without hesitation, including Maya too. For the first time he did not see her as a servant, as someone beneath him, but as the woman who had given his son back his courage, his laughter, and now, perhaps one day, his freedom. His voice broke as he whispered, "Yes, Jacob, you did it. And I have never been prouder." The three of them remained there on the rug, entwined in a moment that felt timeless. For Marcus, it was a revelation. All the boardrooms, all the contracts, all the wealth he had amassed paled before the sight of his son's first step. He had built an empire with iron and ambition, but it was in that fragile step that he discovered true power, the power of love, of resilience, of faith nurtured by kindness. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the mansion settled into its usual stillness, Marcus found himself standing in the hallway before the portrait of his late wife. He stared at her painted eyes, and for the first time in years he spoke not with bitterness but with peace. "He's healing," he murmured softly. "Because of her, because of Maya. You would have liked her. She has your strength." For a long moment he let silence answer him, and for once it did not feel empty but full, as if somewhere his wife heard and approved. From then on, the estate was no longer a mausoleum. It became a home again. Jacob's laughter echoed daily, filling the grand halls with life that had long been absent. Marcus, once a prisoner of his pride, now allowed himself to kneel on the rug, to laugh without restraint, to carry his boy on his shoulders, even when the weight pressed against his old habits of distance. Maya, though still officially a maid, was treated with a respect that surpassed title or position. To Jacob, she had always been family. To Marcus, she was no longer an intruder, but a cornerstone of the fragile, precious life he was learning to rebuild. And so, the story that had begun with rage and humiliation ended with redemption. The billionaire who had once shouted in anger now spoke in love. The boy who had once sat in silence now dreamed aloud. The maid who had once been dismissed as unworthy now stood at the heart of a family transformed. It was not wealth, nor reputation, nor power that saved them. It was laughter on a rug, the courage to face cruelty, the strength to take one trembling step forward, and the grace to forgive. Together, they had become something richer than any empire, a family.